So I'm going to go ahead and start because I want to make sure that we have the opportunity for dialogue with the audience, with these wonderful presenters we have today. So this is the session, Perspectives and Priorities of Foundations Supporting Education Research. I'm Chris Gutierrez from the University of California, Berkeley, and have had many opportunities to engage with these foundations, at least these people, in so many ways. Our illustrious panel includes Adam Gammeren from the William T. Grant Foundation, Kenton McGuire from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, Naila Desir from the Spencer Foundation, and Sarah Vecchiati, did I say it right? Vecchiati. No, I wanted to have it right. Vecchiati, Foundation for Child Development. So this symposium, with the leadership of the key private foundations in education research, provides an opportunity to hear and to learn from leading scholars now in significant leadership roles about how they are helping to nurture and shape the field, as well as the next generation of researchers in the field. Foundation leaders will share their views of significant challenges and opportunities, their vision of what the next generation of research needs to consider, and their perspectives on what private foundations can do to support and stimulate research of the highest quality from the vantage point of scientific and social and societal significance. So each of the presenters will present some brief remarks highlighting the new possibilities in education research and what the role of foundations might be in light of this vision, including what keeps you up at night. What are those failures? But at the same time, what gives you hope in this work? So I'm going to begin, I'm going to have a series of questions and open up to you. So I want to now, with those questions in mind, turn it over to the panel, and we'll start with Adam.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you to those of you who are here today. I'm Adam Gammeren from the William T. Grant Foundation. Our foundation supports research to improve the lives of young people, and within that broad mission, we have two areas of focus: reducing inequality in youth outcomes and improving the way evidence from research is used in policy and practice. For advocates of evidence, all the foundations represented up here are in the business of supporting research. So the research should yield evidence to improve education. But for advocates of evidence, these are dark times. At the top of our government, we have a person who lies with impunity, whose words twist reality, and yet is excused with a nod to alternative facts. Federal agencies are politicized beyond the normal politicization of government, such that they cast evidence aside. And you can turn right, left, look up and look down and find an agency that has been barred from using science, or that's forbidden to use the word scientific evidence in its budget application, or has marginalized or excluded a scientific advisory group throughout federal agencies. And yet, there are lights in the darkness. Paradoxically, new federal policies are embracing evidence and offering new opportunities for concrete contributions, even at a time when the general tone is to reject science. So in our own field of education, the Every Student Succeeds Act, the successor to No Child Left Behind, calls on states and school districts to implement policies supported by evidence for supporting their most struggling schools. And ESSA does not stand alone in this regard. The Family First Prevention Act, an act in the child welfare space, also changes the landscape for federal policies in child welfare, calling on the use of evidence and implementing an evidence-based approach to keeping children with their families and offering federal aid for that instead of only providing aid in cases of foster care or group homes. Just 2 weeks ago, the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act was reauthorized. Here, too, evidence was embraced. In fact, calling for the first time for a disaggregation of justice or punishment statistics by race, ethnicity, and calling on states to make these disparities evident in ways that have been hidden before, in the same way that No Child Left Behind did for education almost 20 years ago. So there are lights, and as supporters of research, the foundations represented here play a crucial role in furnishing the evidence to support these new opportunities. Now, you may say, yeah, but we can support research as much as we want. In today's climate, nobody's going to embrace it and use it seriously. And it's very true that each of the federal programs that I've described depends on implementation for its success. So I was speaking with a justice system expert last week about the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. I thought, wow, this is great. I can't believe this passed in the Trump administration. I can't believe the current president signed it. He said, yeah, well, the implementation, watch for the implementation, because it's the current U.S. Justice Department that's going to monitor whether states are adhering to it, and this expert that I spoke to was not sanguine about the prospect for actually using this new reauthorization in the cause of social justice. But my view is that just because we're in dark times now doesn't absolve us of responsibility of producing evidence for the future. The William T. Grant Foundation has experience with this. Probably the most famous thing our foundation ever did was to produce a report called The Forgotten Half. It was a report published in 1988, more than 30 years ago, on our national underinvestment in young people who don't go to college. So this appeared during the Reagan-Bush years, and nothing happened with it until Bill Clinton was elected in 1992. And subsequently, the Workforce Investment Act, which was passed under his administration, drew on the recommendations of that 1988 report. So similarly, the research that we are funding today, even if it doesn't have immediate application, may have a role in the future. Beyond funding of individual research studies, I think foundations can play 3 roles. They all start with M, 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 M. So the first is messaging. So we can push research out there. We can elevate the visibility of the research studies that we fund. We can enhance the recognition of findings of other funders who are supported by other funders who share our common goals. So some foundations start with the answer, and they only want to fund research that will arrive at the answer that they've already predetermined. The 4 foundations that sit up here, all funders of education research, don't start with answers, start with questions. So at the William T. Grant Foundation, our question is, what programs, policies, and practices will reduce inequality in youth outcomes, and how can we improve the way evidence is used in policy and practice? Those are our questions. We rely on the research community to come up with the answers. The second key role of a funder is mobilizing. We can collaborate with other funders and with other public figures and with researchers to pursue common aims. We can be more powerful working together than separately. And the third M is making connections, the convening power of foundations. If there's one thing I've learned after 5 years in the job is that we have an ability to bring people together in a way that other actors are not able to, partly because we can pay for it. And that can exert powerful leverage. So I want to mention that we have a new resource that can be helpful to you. It's a book about methods for studying the use of research evidence. This is a sprawling, diffuse field, not very systematic. And so we asked Drew Jitomer and his colleague Kevin Krause to pull together some systematic approaches to just studying the use of research evidence. I've brought a few copies with me, and there's a few left on a chair up here. You can grab one, or you can go to the website of the William T. Grant Foundation on the homepage and click where it says, send me a copy, or you can also download it. So help yourself to the few remaining, or get one on the web. Finally, what keeps me up at night? Well, now that I see the big picture, our own efforts, as prodigious as they are, seem small. You know, as a researcher, in my 30-year career as a researcher, I kept my eyes on my own work. Now I see a broader landscape. And reducing inequality is a huge challenge, but we can't, in our position, we can't step back from the fact that our job is not just to support good projects one by one, it's to make a difference in the lives of young people. And that's what makes it tough for me to get to sleep.
So I'm going to actually have you hold a lot of your comments on inequality, because I actually want to take that up as one of essential questions. So I know you're all going to allude to it, but I think it's such an important issue that I'd like to, after your comments, to really take some of that up as part of this larger conversation. But with that, Kent?
Well, thank you. I run the education program at the Hewlett Foundation. We're not, like my three colleagues up here, built to support research specifically. Right? We have a set of programs that were informed by the interest and the will of Bill and Flora Hewlett, and they span a number of really big problems, global and domestic. But the first thing I'd say is that we think about evidence as hugely important in setting strategy in any of the program areas that the foundation pursues. One really timely example that sort of links to the environment or the climate, you know, that Adam just sent, would be around climate. My colleague who runs the climate initiative came from the State Department and negotiated the Paris Accord. Wow. Right? And so we have sort of been the foundation around the world. We have a few partners who stood the science up deliberately as a basis for arguing, about a set of actions that needed to occur, as a basis for recruiting other philanthropic and government partners around the world to help us work on that issue. And in fact, the science, which is complicated and varied, has been a huge factor in mapping out where the work needs to happen around the world, the kinds of opportunities that we think it's possible to get traction on, so forth and so on. So while we don't have a mission to sort of worry about the kind of quality and integrity of the research enterprise, we rely heavily on it across all of our program areas. In education, we probably worry less about the kind of new frontiers of discovery. We think we've got colleagues who've got that very much, in hand, right? We worry a lot more about the structures and processes through which research gets done. I do anyway. I'm not sure how much support for this kind of work. Well, let me say it differently. It's like 5 foundations under one roof, and really depends on who the directors of these little micro foundations are, how much attention to and interest in research we have. So I come with a more expressed interest in it probably than my predecessor did. Barb's predecessor, Mike Smith, on the other hand, came with very clear interest, and so it sort of kind of vacillates. For us, right now, the whole question of learning about how to improve learning outcomes for the least advantaged, this new diverse majority of students in the K-12 system is central. And so we don't think our strategy is tuned if it doesn't actually privilege a set of big research questions, and we don't figure out how to organize our grant making in ways that set us up to answer or begin to answer some of those questions. So in terms of structures and processes, we're likely to invest in more than one guidance system, research networks, and kind of groups of folk who can help us think through of all the things we could learn about, which ones are particularly ripe given what we're trying to do, which ones would map onto the resources that are available to us. We work on problems over a long period of time, but we're all on terms at Hewlett, which means we pass through the place. I like to describe myself as having an 8-year lease, and then I have to turn in the keys to my apartment, right? But so we care about the time horizons as well, and ultimately we care about whether or not there are partners out there with whom we can, work and engage. We are an investor in research practice partnerships because we worry a lot about the relationships between the research community and the world of practice and policy. We worry a lot about communications because we care about the extent to which the public broadly sees and understands what we know and the use of evidence and the like. And finally, I care a lot about the nature and diversity in the research community itself. So we're trying to think hard about, I think often what gets studied is a function of who's doing it. So, so we care a lot about trying to line up the people who do the work with what we think of as the intended beneficiaries, philanthropic speak, of the work that we try to do. So in a sense, all of those things keep me up at night, Chris. The progress that we think we're able to make on those frontiers. If I had one thing I'll say before I run out of time, being in Silicon Valley is a unique experience in and of itself, let me tell you, particularly when you move from the South. But one thing you see out there is you see an enormous amount of private capital moving into the development of platforms for learning and big data and the like. I don't know if this anxiety is justified or not, but there is so much analytic capacity organized around lots of really big data. And the kind of established research community, as would be represented at a meeting like this, is not much involved in the access to or analysis of any of these data. And it does leave me to worry about whether or not these big data sets, privately held behind firewalls, will be put to good use or will in curious ways start to meter out different kinds of learning opportunities for different groups of people. That one does keep me up at night.
So I'm going to start with the what keeps me up at night, and then say a bit more around some of the interesting directions for research in education that I see. And so the Spencer Research funds education research squarely and in a really core way. Much of our giving is field initiated, which means we fund the amazing things that scholars bring to us. Our goal is to invest in education research to cultivate learning and transform lives. So we take that work and the work of scholarship really seriously and think it is a way to improve our world. What keeps me up at night, and I know you said to hold inequality. Well, first of all, nothing really keeps me up at night. I sleep really well. So figuratively, not literally, what keeps me up at night is the vast and growing levels of inequality in our country. And so we'll come back to a conversation on that, but I want to say that just as, I have this 14-year-old son who's a worrier like me, and he came to me the other day and he said, Mommy, the planet in 30 or 40 years is going to be too warm for us to live in. Thank you to your generation for leaving this to us. And I think in his worry was like a visceral sense of things are not going to be okay into the future. And when I think about inequality, it's that kind of visceral sense of things are not going to be okay for our society into the future if we continue on this trend. So that's the first thing. The second thing is maybe not quite as vast, but it's the way that we as a field do our work, the way we do our research work worries me. That in some ways the history of education research and some of the other disciplines has been this desire to prove that we are rigorous like other disciplines. And I think that's meant that we've in some ways eschewed our responsibility as an applied field that's actually supposed to help education systems be better. And so I think a lot about what it means that we do our work too often in the ivory tower, that we do our work for one another and not for the improvement of education systems. And when I say improvement, I don't mean the narrow technocratic notion of improvement, but the broad notion of are things getting better or are things getting worse? When I have a bunch of kids. My other daughter last year, before I came to AERA, she's 19, I was preparing and talking to my friends and planning my outfits and getting it all together. And she was like, so Mommy, I don't understand. Like you and your friends, like you all study inequality in education and you go to this thing every year and you've been doing this for forever and education's getting worse. And she's like looking at me with that teenage, like, you really don't understand anything. But I think in that way she's right. Like what the disconnect between what we do here at AERA and what we do in our universities and what the world needs us to do is too great. And so we've been thinking at Spencer around what's the opportunity of being a foundation that can create new kinds of opportunities and structures to connect education research to policy and practice and the public discourse. Which brings me to the third thing that keeps me up at night, which is the reductive way that education is thought about and talked about in the public. Because I think it matters for because the public includes policymakers, includes teachers, includes principals, and so the reductive way we think about learning, the reductive way we think about outcomes, the reductive way we think about what we're up to with education is really worrisome to me. So I'll say what I think are some kind of opportunities, and they come straight out of those concerns. The first is that I think there's a great opportunity for us to think bigger, to take up the grand challenges of our field, theoretical challenges, empirical challenges, methodological challenges. I resonate very much with what you said, Kent, about big data and thinking about there is a new data infrastructure, a new scene around data that we have to figure out how to use for good, right? And the challenges and taking up the kind of grand challenges of our systems of education and really digging into that. I think to do that work, we will need research that is broad-minded, that is ambitious, that speaks in new ways to non-research communities, and that will likely require new kinds of collaborations across disciplinary lines. So I think this is a moment where, when I talk to scholars in the field, this is the kind of work people want to be doing. And so thinking about how, again, we as a foundation can provide some support structures to help people dig into that work is really, really exciting to me. So I think I'll stop there.
So the Foundation for Child Development has been in existence since 1898 and has always been focused on young children, so children from prenatal birth all the way through age 8. And the foundation has always supported research that is working at the intersection of policy and practice. So it has always had an applied focus. And we have 2 new directions that we've been focusing on in our programmatic direction, which harken actually back to the implementation point that you made, Adam. We see that we have learned a lot from early care and education research about high quality early care and education experiences and how it contributes to the developmental potential of children. What we do have a concern about is that we feel like we need to take a deeper look to really figure out what are the essential components of early care and education that are leading to those outcomes for children, and to have a deep understanding of what is working, what is not working, and for whom and under what conditions. And so we feel like we need to push beyond the early care and education tradition of doing summative evaluations and really focus on implementation, because it's in the actual execution of the programs that we can figure out what is working or not working for children. And if we don't answer the questions that are related to implementation and don't answer the questions that the public and policymakers have, while we're seeing this trend of increasing early care and education programs in terms of scaling up and how we maintain those questions, we maintain those programs at scale. If we don't answer those questions around scale up and maintenance, we are going to risk, 1, not reaching the outcomes we want for children, but 2, we risk losing the resources that have been invested in early care and education, because we have to demonstrate how they're effective and for whom and for why. And so the foundation is really pushing this agenda for moving the field towards doing more implementation research to get at these questions. And the second piece to that is we also feel that there's been a lot of research about the early care and education workforce, but we really need to have a concerted, explicit, and greater attention paid to the early care and education workforce, because we know that it's the interactions between teachers and caregivers and children, and we know it's the individuals that work with children and the intellectually stimulating environments that they create that lead to those children's outcomes. So if we don't know how to support the workforce in terms of preparation, in terms of competency, in terms of well-being, in terms of compensation, in terms of instructional practice, if we don't know exactly what is working or not working with the professionals that are working directly with children, then we're never going to be able to get to the level of high quality programs at scale that we want. And so our second focus is an entirely all-in approach to focusing our research on the early care and education workforce and looking at those questions about what's happening in classrooms and in homes directly working with children. And that vision, actually, to answer the second question about what does it mean when you have this direction and what does that mean as a funder and as a leader in funders, well, it does mean that we actually have to be not just a researcher or a thought leader, but it also means that we have to be somewhat of a diplomat and an advocate in pushing our agenda. Because we are actually trying to push the status quo to think a bit differently. And that does mean changing minds and working in the field with many individuals who have contributed to the initial foundational knowledge and getting people to think differently. And that can be uncomfortable sometimes. So we have to be an advocate in order to move the status quo even further to achieve the goals that we want. It also means, from the point of Kent, your piece about communications, is that it means that we have to be able to be clear in our communications to reach a variety of audiences. So we're not just talking to the research field, we're also trying to talk to policymakers, to practitioners, to other funders, to get funders to also buy into the approach that we have of what we need to do for early care and education research. And that takes a special communication skill to be able to talk to all those different audiences and make those clear points in a way that they can hear them and then also be responsive to them. And third, to your point about collaboration, we cannot do this alone. So we are constantly trying to look at ways that we can collaborate, not with just other funders, but also with the practitioners and policymakers in the field, in order to identify the research questions of interest, in order to co-create those questions to make sure that they're going to be useful to the individuals that need our research and need our findings in order to improve implementation. So it really does have, whatever our programmatic direction is, it does have an impact in terms of the way we work. In terms of what keeps us up at night, the Foundation for Child Development is a small but mighty foundation that has a legacy of always having a larger footprint. Many folks think that we have a staff of 20. We do not. So I feel that pressure to live up to that legacy. And part of that legacy really is to make sure that what we are investing our grant funds in is making a difference. And how can I measure that impact? And so that's what keeps me up at night, is demonstrating to the board and to the public that what we're investing in is actually making a difference. And how do you create those type of markers and measures of success when you're talking about issues like policy change? Your example of mentioning the fact that you had a report and then years later it had an impact, right? That's very challenging for a foundation when there could be short-term income outcomes, but really what you're trying to do is in a long-term way. And what is the expectation for actual policy practice change along that continuum? Is it also about allocation of resources, having policymakers distribute their resources differently to do a greater investment? Is it about just building their knowledge and institutional capacity to do the work and to hope that maybe one day these sound bites will actually make a difference? Is it about also making sure that you're influencing the field and that people are citing your research and that people are adopting the messaging communications framework? People are adopting the priorities. Is it about strengthening your grantees in terms of their own institutional capacity and relationship building? And is it about leveraging other funds? How are you able to make sure that your small amount of money is also the impact is tenfold because you've partnered with other foundations? So these are the things that keep me up at night in order to meet the legacy that I really do feel that the Foundation of Child Development has. So I'm also looking forward to hearing about what other folks think about measuring impact as well.
Thank you. Sarah, you remind me, of course, mine was from a very less powerful vantage point than the four of you, but I know as being president of AERA and then working on the Obama transition team and then on the IES board with Adam, we were concerned with there was attention to funding, but there was a less attention to figuring out how to synthesize in some meaningful way, some meaningfully coherent way, I should say, what we've actually learned from research in ways that it would make it easier to inform policy and practice. So we're good at funding and doing good stuff, but then what? So that's what keeps me up at night. But so let me make another turn that you've all alluded to. And there's been, again, a rise in some interesting critique about private foundations and their role in society. I'm thinking of the books Winners Take All and my colleague Robert Reich's The Common Good, and particularly one that I actually, after our conversation, I went out and picked up and started reading all of them, but really got into the Decolonizing Wealth by Edgar Villanueva, who is really provocative. He illuminates how, we say his words, how philanthropy has evolved to mirror colonial structures, ultimately doing more harm than good. He's talking about big foundations too, though. Characterized by old boy networks, savior complexes, and internalized oppression. And it gives a 7-step kind of rehabilitation plan that he thinks will help what he calls healing, because he's taken an indigenous perspective, and he talks about you have to grieve, apologize, listen, relate, represent, invest, and repair as some of the ways to do it. And then he asks the questions, what if money could heal us? Which I thought was really interesting. So I wonder if you could kind of respond to the set of critiques, even though some larger organizations are more complicit and more the objects of his critique, but nevertheless, you're part of it. If you could respond to these set of critiques and then address the important turn to equity and inequality in which a number of you are actually engaged very explicitly in your work. And as part of that, like, what's your big vision? Well, first, like, so what's up with this turn to equity? I'm really curious about that. And what's your vision about how to address these significant challenges to support inequality, especially in light of the small-scale efforts that actually the 4 of you are engaged in? When you think about it in the context of big foundations, these are small-scale efforts. So that's a mouthful of stuff. But I think that they're important challenges right now, and these books that you all actually led me to were really provocative in helping us kind of think about the role of foundations. So I'm going to turn it over to you in no particular order to have a conversation about this.
I'll start us off because I've been reading. I haven't read the Villanueva book, but I've read the others. I haven't read that one yet. So I take a little bit of kind of sadistic delight in watching people on opposite sides of a thing raise issues that make the other group uncomfortable. So I've been really enjoying this turn and watching these books come on the scene that critique philanthropy and push, I'll say us, with a grain of salt, push us to think about what it means to operate in the world with privilege and what it means to operate in the world with the privilege that money accords. And I think they're important pushes, because I think that one of the critiques that cut across those pieces is to say philanthropy thinks about itself as the people who do good, right? And it's important to consider how that doing good with a big pot of resources is an exercise of power and privilege, and in fact sometimes might not be that good. And what are the opportunity costs, and what are the ways a founder's interests get represented and perpetuated when you can have a pot of money that carries you indefinitely into the future? And are those the folks who should be setting the tone and the agenda and the solutions for the country? So the critiques are partly about power and about outsized power. So I guess I would just say that I think that they are, in the ideal world, the critiques would push us to be more mindful, would push us to think about how we're engaging communities more deeply, how the agendas that we set aren't just the agendas of the boards and the founders, but are the agendas of the communities that we call ourselves serving. There's some other really more kind of technical controversial things about the endowments and whether you should be spending down the endowments or whether you should be spending out the endowments. I'll be curious to see how that lands, because it's so antithetical to like the culture of what happens inside philanthropy, which is about protecting the endowment. But I think being self-critical and being mindful of the ways that we're exercising power with our giving is really, really important.
So can you highlight maybe some of the turn to equity?
Well, you wanted us to do it all in one?
Well, we can.
I was separating those things in my head. I'll come back to that. Yeah.
Let's deal with the critique first.
Yeah.
Then.
Okay, I'd love to jump in at this
Yes,
point,
please.
if that's okay.
That's just fine.
So I share the sympathies of these critics. I think wealth should be used to advance the cause of justice, but I think the critiques are pushing at the wrong problem. Specifically, the critique that philanthropy is undemocratic. No one elected Bill Gates, no one elected Sam Walton to push their agendas through their wealth on the population. That is true. No one elected these rich people to spread their wealth in ways that they prefer. But the solution to that is not to push back at philanthropies. The solution is taxation of wealth. We have a system, a perfectly good system, for skimming wealth off of those who are successful in our capitalist system and deploying it in democratic ways through our elected officials. It's called income tax. And the problem is not that rich people get to decide what to do with their money. The problem is that we are not taking and exercising the power that we have to decide what to do with their money. We have a way to deal with this, and we're not doing it. And in fact, as everybody knows, we're going in the opposite direction. We're letting rich people get away with more of their wealth instead of grabbing it. Some young politicians have recently called for a 70% tax bracket on incomes over $10 million. And there's an outrage. It's radical. It's unheard of. It will destroy incentives. No, it won't. We used to have higher taxes than we have today. And we had a very productive, one of the most productive periods in our history occurred when we had a 70% tax bracket. And calling for 70% on incomes over $10 million, I think demonstrably will not diminish incentives. So philanthropists are on the side of the good, and they get to decide what to do with their money because it is their money. And it is not unjust or undemocratic to take that stance. It is capitalist. And if you can critique capitalism, which favors the accumulation of wealth. You can critique capitalism. But within our capitalist system, the philanthropists who are giving money away to serve causes that they deem just, I think that is appropriate. And if you don't like it, tax them.
Strong stance.
Jump in, panel.
For someone who can't keep a job, it means I've had a few of them. I can remember still, years ago, getting a call from the governor's office. I was at the Lilly Endowment. Easy to talk about foundations where you no longer work than it is for the ones that you work. But I will come to Hewlett. But we had just funded a big study. And the study was motivated by a policy that then Governor Evan Bayh had advanced. He was going to install a high stakes 9th grade exam, right? And so we put a lot of money, it wasn't we weren't trying to attack that specifically, but we put a lot of money into a survey to try to understand more about the aspirations and the behaviors and supports of students. 8th graders, 10th graders, and 12th graders in Indiana. We oversampled so that we could report by subgroups, by race and gender and so forth. And it just so happened that what the study revealed was sort of a good news, bad news story. Good news was that aspirations for young people were high. Didn't matter. Black, white, male, female. It was really encouraging because imagine how hard it would be to have to attack a problem at the level of aspiration and motivation, right? The bad news was the likelihood that these young people would realize their dreams and aspirations varied enormously. by race and gender, and underneath that, by whether or not a sibling or mom or dad had traveled this circuitous route from school to college before, right? So we called it sort of a good news, bad news story. And we set about a whole year of telling that story. This was our comms strategy. And then, Chris, stop me if I take too long with this. And then Gary Orful, who was one of the people, analyzing these data, happened to be in a room with Evan Bayh up at the Kennedy School one day. And Evan turned to Evan and said, "Governor, you're wrong." Ooh. Right? In a way that only Gary could do, right? And Evan, who is this guy? Right? So the next day my phone rings. And the question was, are we intruding? Are we sort of now lobbying, getting into, that was the kind of threat that, governor sort of, leaned into us on. And I said, that's why we make grants. This wasn't a contract. We didn't issue a contract to go after your policy. We sort of made a grant around a set of questions that we thought was demonstrably in the public interest to know, right? So what I would say is that, yes, this is private wealth. I do think, and we had this internal conversation at the endowment, that we enjoy the relief from taxation on the premise that we're doing something that's demonstrably in the public interest, right? And so I think the test really is, is that true? Now, the Hewletts did the following things with regard to that. A, they gave up a controlling interest on the board because they wanted to build the board out in a way that they could argue, at least, that the public is represented. And they introduced term limits and a series of other things. So they're on the board, but they're in a distinct minority. B, they had a decided interest in trusting the field to do good work. That shows up in two core ways. Many of its grant-making strategies are actually about field building. And C, our preferred, we don't always do this, but our preferred approach is to grant general operating support. So we invest in the missions of the organizations, and then we get out of their way and let them do work. And then D, we have a strong bias for measuring and evaluating and publicizing the impacts of our grant making. We have a unit called Effective Philanthropy, whose job it is to both help people inside the foundation make decisions about how to study and report on what we do, and then they oversee the external communications of that work. So we're not perfect. It is a place that thinks it hired a lot of smart people that know as much or more about what the problems are as you guys, but there are these internal structures and processes designed to at least increase the likelihood that our work is in the public interest. Last thing I want to say, which goes to these books. We sort of took on explicitly the winner takes all, argument, and poked some holes in the nature of the work we think the author actually did. So forth. I won't go into that here. But we did decide to do one more thing, and I could use some advice about this. We decided that, and the board's concerned about it, that we might actually be operating largely in our own bubble. Right? We mostly talk to the people we know. We sort of deal with and make grants to folks, whose interest, we share. I think the conversation last night, was really important in this regard. So we've decided across the 5 program areas to deliberately go find people with whom we disagree. And we're going to bring them into the foundation at the level of strategy and see if we can't hear and understand their point of view. No one's asking us to agree or change anything we do, but we think we owe it to our work and its integrity to sort of find people who would actually challenge us intellectually about the assumptions we're making, the warrants we're advancing, and the claims that we are arguing about what will happen if we spend this money in these kinds of ways. So I do think that there are ways that the philanthropic community could respond to these critiques if they so chose. Sorry that took me so long.
Thank you.
So our perspective is that we do need to understand and acknowledge and learn from history, whether it's the history of the foundation or our nation or a particular society or subgroup, that it really is important to understand that, because it serves to inform how we can change positive for the future. So if we need to learn from the past and not repeat it. But we still are committed to doing good, because we are trying to make change for the future in a positive way. But I think because philanthropy also recognizes that there is an inherent power imbalance, because we do have funding and we do have agendas and we do have resources, and that power imbalance can be with grantees or with a particular field that we're trying to work in. Because of that, I think that it's incumbent upon us to make sure, like you were talking about learning from people who have differing opinions, that we are, one, acknowledging our own biases in what we're doing, and two, also listening to a diverse perspectives and different lived experiences, so that is informing our work to make sure that we are being respectful and transparent and not living in our own bubble. So that's how we see the perspective of moving forward.
Since they're filming, I have to stand up here. So now let's engage this really important question about this turn that is more evident now to at least me and lots of people in the field, this turn to issues, addressing issues of inequality that seem to be more at the center. It's not that they weren't there, but they are highlighted and maybe serve as an organizing principle for some of your foundations that I think is really interesting. And I'd love to hear how you, what kind of incited that turn, and what does it look like, and where do you think it's going to take us?
Want to go first?
Okay, so one thing that I think the turn for us grows out of an attempt to analyze the kind of impacts across our programs of what's been happening, where we see the data. It shows a sort of increased stratification, is sort of really problematic, and it sort of bleeds into questions of participation in our democracy. That's what the Madison Initiative is about for us. It is, we're worried about it from a climate point of view. We know as the planet heats up and you get these dramatic natural disasters and the like, that the flow of migration and immigration is going to kind of really present challenges, around the world. As we think about our kind of education work and the extent to which we have not figured out how to advance qualitative literacy, I'll use that today anyway. And then something funny happened. Our foundation is young compared to yours. We're 50 years old, a little bit more than 50 years old, and we decided to celebrate that. I wasn't even at Hewlett yet, but one of the things we decided to do in celebrating it was to reflect back on who got the money. And what we observed was that a relatively small number of organizations and people got a huge percentage of all the money that we advance. We give away $450 million a year. So it's real money, right? And then a couple of other things happened. I'll just talk about the education work. Someone rendered a critique and wondered whether or not, this program called Deeper Learning has a race problem, right? A guy at Harvard. Now, sometimes when we have critics, we turn them into grantees, that helps. And he is now a grantee. But the institution decided it ought probably look more closely at who its grantees are. Unlike many, Hewlett had never done a survey. It had never asked its grantees to report on their demographics, who serves on their boards, the demographics of the leadership and staff. So we have just done that. And the data have just come back to us, at the program level. We wish we had, a complete 100% response rate. Our initial rate was somewhere in the high 60s. A debate ensued about whether that was high enough on which to act. Some of us thought it was, some of us thought it wasn't. So we are now going to continue to advance that survey until we get from 60 to 100. But we're already asking ourselves, what should we do about what we observe? It has ensued quite a debate. One, about what we value and mean by diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's important work inside the foundation to do. We're much better at giving people money to have them work on that problem themselves than we are at working on it internally. So the data has stimulated those kinds of conversations. And finally, we're trying to figure out how do we attend. So for education, here's the number. 0.8 of our grantees are led and or governed by white people. We have a fairly high percentage of women in that mixture, but if you sort of look across the pool, generally speaking, not terribly diverse. The board says, well, you should do something about that, but be careful not to, worry about strategy. So there's this interesting tension between what are our strategies, implying we should do, and who we would give the money to what? Enact those strategies. I am responding in the following way in the short run. I am saying, well, our strategy should probably turn into contexts where the people we argue most need our help and where we most need to learn how to make a positive difference. So place or context now becomes a variable, in our strategy. It doesn't guarantee I have a solution to who I give the money to, but that's an example of how this issue shows up and the sort of practical tensions and realities about how you work through it in a private, foundation like ours.
Sarah?
the foundation has always had a focus on low-income, vulnerable populations, but we do recognize that we've made some shifts. So one is just when we, in the past, changed our mission statement to make it more strength-based and less having a deficit approach. So it was things like fortifying the assets in the individual community and society. It's about protecting against harmful consequences of social exclusion and discrimination and economic instability. And it's about developing the strength of children's full potential. So one, I think it's an important orientation to move from a more of deficit approach to a strength-based approach. Secondly, we do see our agenda for implementation research as a tool, actually, to help address the issues of inequity, because it is about trying to figure out for whom and under what conditions programs are working or not working for subgroups of children, and trying to differentiate across those dimensions. And so it's been very clear to us that implementation research can be a strategy to address inequity. But we've also had a pivot that we have to be more explicit in our discussions of inequity. I think it's always been implicit, but now we're thinking about how it needs to be explicit, and in terms of defining what we mean by ethnicity, race, gender, class, language status. What are the different configurations of how we're looking at where inequity can arise? And so that is also important, that we are strength-based, that we are explicit in terms of what we mean and how the strategies that we use are going to address it. And then a third dimension is that we also acknowledge in the past we have had some strategies that are lifting all boats, and that is actually not going to address inequity. That there is, in essence, you do need different or additional resources for particular subgroups in order to ensure equal opportunity and in order to ensure structural barriers are eliminated or reduced. That it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and so it's entirely possible that you need to be targeting your resources. And so for that, in our Young Scholars Program, which supports early career researchers, we have decided to provide targeted technical assistance to help certain scholars, as they apply, have assistance in developing their proposal, whether it's because of the particular research question that they're asking that needs to be developed, whether it's because of the institutional supports they're receiving, whether it's because they had particular weaknesses in methodology and design, and also looking at scholars of color. So for us, it was the configuration of all those different parameters that led us to realize that equitable approaches don't necessarily mean the same size or same treatment or equal equality in treatment. That in order to really ensure equal opportunity, different levels of intensity of assistance will be needed. So I think that was an important shift for us and our board to make. And then also, we are constantly talking about the achievement gap. We think that it's also related to the opportunity gap, and for us, trying to unpack the interrelations between achievement and opportunity gap is really important in the next round of our research to make sure that the implementation research that we're studying actually results in eliminating those achievement and opportunity gaps. And so we have to have a better understanding of the relationship between those two in order to define the strategies moving forward.
Well, when I came to the William T. Grant Foundation in 2013, I had two things in mind. One, the focus on improving the way evidence from research is used in policy and practice should continue. It had just gotten started. I thought it held great promise. I think that view's been vindicated. And then my other idea was that the focus at that time, which was on improving the settings or environments where young people develop, had made a lot of contributions, but it was time to do something new. And through a process of discussion with board, staff, and researchers in the field, quickly became apparent that reducing inequality would be our new focus. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out. You got a board that's interested in inequality. They hire a new leader whose research career is on inequality, and lo and behold, the new focus of the William T. Grant Foundation is on reducing inequality.
Stunned.
Stunned. The one piece that might have been surprising is the emphasis on reducing inequality. You know, in the sociology of inequality where I come from, there's a lot more work on how much inequality there is, what its sources are, and what its terrible consequences are, and not very much on programs, policies, and practices to reduce inequality. And that's the lens we've brought to the foundation. And I'm pleased with it, and I think we've made progress, but I'm also concerned. One of our board members is Prudence Carter, known to many of you, and it won't surprise you to hear that Prudence is constantly pushing us to say, when are you going to deal with the big problems? So we are funding one study at a time of a specific program or a specific policy change, and sometimes the results are thumbs up. If we did this, we get less inequality. Sometimes the results are thumbs down, didn't work, try again. But all of those pieces do not add up to reducing inequality for young people in America, which is the goal. When I started, my thinking was the only way to get to that goal was to do lots of little things and have them accumulate into something big thing. I no longer hold that view. I've come to recognize that we need changes at the macro social level. These changes, these micro-social changes, one at a time, especially disconnected or siloed as they are not going to accumulate to result in the reduction of inequality in the United States. So some examples of how we're trying to push in this direction, we have a digest that we put out every year. It's messages from the foundation to the field. These are the issues we would love you to grapple with. So this year we had 2 essays, one from Tim Smeating, the other from Sandy Darity, William Darity Jr., both economists, pushing on this question of these small-scale programs are not going to get us there. And so Smeating took on the issue of socioeconomic inequality. What big changes do we need to reduce socioeconomic inequality in America? And Darity took on the question of racial inequality. And he spoke about reparations, and he spoke about child allowances and other macro-social programs to reduce inequality. And I encourage each of you to read those essays. They're also on our homepage. Get inspired by them and put your efforts in that direction. And finally, 3 weeks ago, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine released a report called A Roadmap to Reducing Child Poverty. This was a committee headed by Greg Duncan, who happens to be a member of our Board of Trustees, a committee charged with answering the question of how can we cut child poverty in half in 10 years. And first question they answered was, can we cut child poverty in half in 10 years? And the answer is yes, we can. In fact, child poverty has diminished at certain points. In 1999, the US and the UK had similar levels of child poverty. 10 years later, the UK had half the level of poverty as in the United States. So it can be done. Second of all, they outlined 4 specific strategies, combinations of programs that would accomplish this goal to varying degrees. 2 of the program rely on a combination of tax changes and redistribution policies. Each would indeed cut child poverty in half. The cost is between $90 and $110 billion per year, so very expensive. But one of the strategies, which they call their work-oriented strategy, costs less than $9 billion a year, would cut child poverty by 20% and bring 1 million low-income people into the workforce. We ought to do that tomorrow. So I'm very proud that our foundation and several other private funders supported this work. It lays out literally a roadmap to accomplishing big goals in a short time. And I think in addition, we're not going to stop funding research on specific programs or small-scale policies to turn growing inequality into declining inequality, but we also need to take a look at these big efforts.
So I was thinking about what you said about the board hired you, and lo and behold, there's a focus on inequality. I think I feel a little bit like that too, which means that the focus on inequality, and in my case, maybe even a more explicit focus on racial inequality as well as social inequality, started before I got there, because I came into this role from a prior role as Vice Chancellor of Equity and Inclusion at a major university. Prior to that, had a long career as a scholar who studies race, inequality, and education. So I think that it was pretty much assumed that that interest and focus of mine would take shape through the foundation work as I started it. So it's taking shape in several interesting ways. And some of it is about what we're doing that's externally focused and how we're organizing our giving, how we're organizing our strategies. Some of it is more internally focused, actually, which is to say, how do we reduce bias and reduce, I'll say it that way, how do we reduce bias in our processes internally and ensure that as we're vetting proposals that we're doing so in a way that is equitable, that leaves us more likely to fund folks that we haven't funded before, folks from underrepresented groups, folks from underrepresented universities. So there's a kind of whole range of dimensions there as well. So I'll just say one thing about what we're doing externally, and I'll say two things about what we're doing internally along those lines. The first is that we're just in the beginning of a planning stage this year of an initiative that we're calling Cultivating Equitable Education Spaces. And that, for us, is about, as I mentioned in the beginning, Spencer's predominantly field initiated. We felt it was important to stay that way, meaning we felt that we serve a really important function in the field to fund across the entire field, to not just take our focus and pivot on any one issue. At the same time, there's some really key critical issues that we want to spend some energy on. So our kind of compromise there was to keep many of the funding programs field initiated, but also to create these initiatives that give us some way of focusing on specific issues. So this initiative around equitable education spaces seeks to bring people together, to bring scholars together across the various subfields in our field, to think together, to your point, Chris, about what do we know, right? What do we know about what equitable education spaces look like and how we structure them in? What do we not know? And what's the research we need moving forward? So the goal of the initiative is to do some synthesizing, some agenda setting, and then as we do that, to also again deepen the relationships with policymakers, practitioners, so that the work that happens underneath the initiative happens in collaboration with the systems and structures that researchers are seeking to change. So that's that. Internally, though, it has been really fascinating to think about how we select reviewers, the steps in our review process, how many eyes do we need on a proposal to feel confident that it's been vetted properly. All of these kind of like in some ways boring technical things, but that really matter for the outcomes to your point, Kent, about who are we funding and how do we get there? And so we're also, and how do we disrupt the fact that we're funding largely, well, it's being filled. How do we how do we disrupt the ways in which our funding can sometimes reproduce privilege in our field? Let's put it that way. And so one commitment that we have made that actually came out of our engagement with the field last year was to move from a system where we were giving feedback to about 30% of folks who sent us proposals to a system where we're going to be giving feedback to 100% of the proposals that come in the door. That's important for us with respect to equity, because one of the things that we know is writing a research grant proposal is a specialized skill. And the way that you learn it typically is in communities of people who know how to do it well. And if you're writing proposals that are not being funded, it's often not that you don't have a good idea, it's that you don't know how to write a proposal that's going to get funded. And so our commitment to feedback is to say, our goal in reading proposals is both about finding great ones to study and also about building the capacity in the field for people to write strong research proposals. So that's up there.
Well, with some of the time we have left, I want to open it up to your questions. We have an opportunity here to engage our four major funders. Yes, please.
I have one question about, so I love what you're all doing. You could be the Pied Piper and I'd be right behind you. How are there collaborations that you can call out amongst your organizations? Leveraging of resources, we talked about that. So what have you guys done together?
Yeah.
Oh, amongst the four of us, or just in general?
I would like to know first, amongst the four of you, since you guys are all champions in this work, and not, then with other organizations.
Yeah, I think we have things to talk about.
Yeah, the William T. Grant Foundation and the Spencer Foundation have a long history of collaboration. We would love to collaborate with the Foundation on Child Development and the Hewlett Foundation also. There may be some opportunities for that that we've discussed, but most recent big victory of our collaboration is the Institutional Challenge Grant, which is a project that we initiated to challenge universities to develop partners with public agencies, to jointly develop a research agenda, to jointly execute the research agenda, to build the capacity of the public agency to use evidence in its decision making, to shape or reshape or remold the incentive structure within universities to support engaged scholarship. So as you can imagine, this is, I will speak for you, this is something both of our foundations are interested in, and it turned out that the strongest competitors this year were in education, and that we were having a very difficult time to decide, to narrow it down. And so we were so grateful and pleased and thrilled to include Senior Vice President Megan Bang on our selection committee to select two winners, the University of Colorado Boulder, one of whose staff key leaders is here, and University of Toronto, working with Puerto Rico, and with the Puerto Rico Department of Education, Boulder working with Denver to pursue this agenda. So that is a great example of being able to do something that we couldn't have done alone.
Yeah. I would underscore that and also add that I think there's also the collaborative nature of thinking together around what some of the challenges are, what some of the strategies are. And so I feel like many on this stage are also my thought partners. And Kent and I have also been thinking pretty deeply around where our shared interests are and figuring out what shape that will take. You may have an email that you haven't responded to yet. Sure, we'll get to it.
Yeah. I'm sure I will. Yeah.
And I'll also add that I think Adam and I and Vivian have also been thinking about how to pull together our foundations, those on this stage and those beyond this stage, who are thinking in really deep ways around inequality, because that's happening actually in foundations about education outside of education as well. So there's also this interesting collaborative spirit around what are the conversations we want to be starting in the field, and how can we work together to start those conversations or to participate in existing conversations.
Naila's she's got a line into my office that I don't know about, because she pops up, where I'm scheduled. She's had me scheduled, for a while. But good news, we're both on these planning horizons, right? And so it's sort of, these are generative discussions where we're likely to come out with things that we. The other thing I would say is that I spend a lot of time and a little bit of money. There's a big community of education funders, not so deliberately focused on research, but who have a real interest in being guided by research as they think about the work that they do. One thing I would encourage, we have to figure out more about how to make this happen, is to get you guys better connected, one example, to this thing called the Education Funders Strategy Group. It's really a learning community among grant makers who could really benefit from the kind of guidance and perspective that folks who actually fund research would have. So I think this is a moment, generally speaking, where big problems like inequality, we all understand how minuscule our resources are. The flea biting the elephant, and so kind of where to bite matters. And putting our heads together to think about what we know, what more we could do if we could know more, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is the time, I think, finally, where there's some needed humility around the reach and potential of the work we do?
So we've actually partnered with 7 other national foundations to focus on strengthening the early care and education workforce. We are not public yet, but it's called the Early Educator Investment Collaborative, and it will be focused on, it has an equity focus from 2 fronts. One, from the perspective of eliminating the achievement and opportunity gap for children, but 2, also because it's focused on the workforce, and the early care and education workforce is primarily individuals of color, individuals who have low paid wages. So there's a diversity and equity initiative on those 2 fronts. The professionals themselves and the children. And the collaborative will be focusing on 2 fronts. One, to help professionalize the field, so looking at making sure that we have competency-based assessment systems that really can demonstrate what teachers and caregivers should know and be able to do in order to support children's learning. But 2, to also look at teacher preparation and support implementation of innovative teacher prep models, all stemming from the IOM NRC Transforming the Workforce report that came out in 2015 and the Academy's report Transforming the Financing of Early Care and Education. So this initiative has a deep grounding in research from those 2 reports. Right now we're in the stages of doing landscape and policy analysis across the 50 states to help inform the eventual strategies that we work towards as the collaborative. But it is a tremendous grouping of national funders to really have solid investment in helping to strengthen the early care and education workforce.
Yes.
One of the major issues is that you just said you are a tremendous collection of national funders. There are a number of regional foundations that are interested in working in in implementation in some of the space that you are operating in, driven by strong research, evidence-based strategies. And how much have you done in terms of trying to find out who these regional funders might be who could in fact become partners as you are looking at the implementation side? I'm a trustee of one of these regional foundations.
Boy, I hope I mentioned it. Well, in California, we probably think, I lost mine. Yeah. In California, we work a lot with Bechtel and Stewart and others. We've made a lot more progress there. As we work out this context-specific component of our work, we will obviously be looking to find those collaborations. I'd be shocked if we don't land in the South with some of our work. There's Winthrop Rockefeller, there's Mary Reynolds Babcock. I know where those anchors are. I think one challenge for national funders, I'll just make this comment and then stop, and it'll be a challenge for us, is we're sort of accustomed to showing up having made our minds up already about what it is we want to do and how we want to do it. And then those ambitions rub up against things that regional and local funders are doing. So we're going to try to resist the temptation to know going in. I think our plan is to show up with a set of values and a set of ideas about how we think we ought to work on things, and we'll sort of put those values on the table and then look for alignment. But that will be flexing a different set of muscles than we have typically used.
See if we can get more, because there are more people who want to ask questions.
Yes, back here, please.
Good morning. Thank you for this. I was wondering if you could talk about the difference between your focus on inequality and other groups, primarily the federal government, who I think would say they're looking at inequality by providing research that does disaggregated analyses of, say in my area, early childhood education, in terms of access and child outcomes, and how those are related, how that's related to the kinds of evidence that gets privileged in the kinds of grants that get funded.
Is that for Sarah in particular? Or?
That's for across the group, because everybody should be paying attention to early childhood, of course.
So the Foundation for Child Development is entirely focused on early childhood. So the agenda that we have with implementation research is actually to move it beyond just disaggregation of data, because we recognize that the field of early care and education research has been so much focused on overall program quality and overall program outcomes and looking at the average child as the outcomes of success or not, that is not actually helpful in terms of really figuring out what is effective in helping children learn, and that we do need to actually have more studies that are looking at subgroups of children, and not just by race and ethnicity or language status, but across a constellation of parameters, so that we can then figure out how to tailor programs that meet the needs of those children. And that has not been part of the conversation in early childhood, because it's just still on the average child within a randomized controlled trial. And while we think that those type of studies are important, we think that the conversation needs to be greater than that in order to really make sure that, one, that we have high quality programs that are effective and meeting the diverse needs of children, but then two, that we don't risk losing the investment that's been in early childhood, because if we can't continue to demonstrate that they're effective, then we will not get greater investment in early childhood education.
I would maybe just add that I feel like part of what you're alluding to is whether or not the RFPs assume that we're wanting to better understand the ways that institutionally arranged systems are failing, intentionally or not, particular communities, or whether the focus is on how to do one of two things: how to fix broken families, children, and communities, or how to get those families, children, and communities access to the aforementioned broken systems. All of that to say, I think that it's really important that we have a focus on the ways that we have, as a society, arranged opportunity for some and lack of opportunity for others, and that has long-term consequences, both in terms of individual lives, the structure of communities, and actually on the health of our nation and our democracy. So that focus on the systems, I think, is critically important.
We have time for one more question here, please.
I have a question about the shift from looking at individual policies, practices, and programs to the more macro questions. What do you see that shifting in terms of the evidence required to move that lens?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, and one of the reasons that so much of the work that we're supporting is on the narrower, smaller, more micro-social programs is because the evidence is easier to gather. But as we've seen in the recent National Academies report, it is possible to gather data on large parts of the population, and the availability of administrative data and our new technological capacities to analyze those data are showing that and also variation among states or among counties or school districts within states are creating opportunities for drawing inferences about effects of big policies across large portions of the population. So this National Academies report on cutting child poverty in half relied on a simulation implemented at the Urban Institute to take evidence about the effectiveness of policies, evidence about variation in population groups who've been subjected to the policies or the beneficiaries of policies, evidence among parts of the country where different kinds of policies have been implemented, and put this all together and to simulate what the effect would be of implementing new policies like expanding the earned income tax credit or providing a real child care tax credit that would let people go to work, or initiating a minimum wage across a much wider part of the country than we have until now. And so, yes, the data requirements are big, and the technology requirements are big, but they're feasible today in ways they haven't been in the past.
Well, it's time for us. They're moving us quickly out of the rooms, but I want to thank our panelists, not only for their participation here, but for the real contribution that these leaders are making to the field and to shaping the field in ways that I think are just increasingly consequential. So thank you for your work and thank you for your participation.